Good evening, Julie. Thanks for joining us. Literally just getting started. So my name is Gareth. Oh, we've got somebody else arriving. Going crazy all of a sudden. People obviously just dashed off for a quick cup of tea or something. So we're just making a bit of a start. So my name's Gareth. I'm Chief Executive of First Intuition. I was one of the founders and a tutor as well. I have been training accountants for 24, nearly 25 years now, so hoping I can be quite a wealth of sort of knowledge and experience. Please, there's only a small group of us actually live for this. We're going to record the session so we can share with all the people who registered and are unable to actually join us. But please use the chat box to kind of contribute your own thoughts, to ask questions that you've got, any of your own experiences. Got my colleague Rhian is with us to help keep an eye on the chat box. But just to sort of start thinking through, and I did prepare some polls for this, but given there's only a sort of handful of us watching it live, seems a trifle redundant to actually start opening up polls. But I thought, let's kind of use the chat box more than anything. Why might somebody be drawn into accountancy? Why might people think that accountancy and finance is a good kind of career to move into? I'm just going to stop my sharing so I can actually watch the chat box as well. So I'm really hoping for a bit of audience participation here, a bit of engagement from Chris, from Esther, from Julie, from Gabrielle. Thanks for joining us. With such a small group, I'm hoping we can keep it fairly informal. So just in the chat box, which you've got access to at the bottom of your screen. Okay, immediately, good money, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, accountants are, in some respects, kind of famous for earning good salaries. I mean, it's a profession like, law, any other profession. The fact you have to go through exams to get the qualification, you'd hope gives you a certain earning power. When you say a solid career, what do you mean by that, Chris?
I think in terms of trying to sort of find a trade, as if you were an electrician or something, lots of people refer to accountants in a very positive light. I think in the big wide world, I think it's the accountants probably more down on accountants than anybody else. But it does. It's got that reputation of being, it's the sort of thing that your mother would like their sons and daughters to marry accountants. It's that sort of thing. It's traditional. It's the way a lot of people have thought about, like lawyers. And I must admit, when I went to uni, everybody wanted to do law. I never thought about that. But I think a lot of people think of accounting in those sorts of terms.
Yeah, nice, safe career, respectable, probably quite a reliable. And in fact, something that we've seen, even in the current situation with COVID, which obviously is having big impacts on certain parts of the economy. Actually, we're seeing recruitment levels for accountants still pretty good. I guess whether the economy is doing well or doing badly, you need accountants. Yes. Perhaps it's quite a secure job, even in difficult economic circumstances. You've got some more points coming in. You've got some other coming in there, Rhian, in the chat box.
Yeah. So Julie says that she loves the story that the numbers tell her. That was really good.
Yeah, and I've always thought that accountants are to a degree storytellers. It's not just enough to be able to number crunch and create accounts. It's then it's almost like analysis, interpretation of what's going on in the accounts, and then the ability to communicate. I've always found, I must admit, when even when I'm receiving board reports from my FD, she'll send me through spreadsheets and KPIs and benchmark, and fair enough. I mean, I'm a qualified accountant. I teach this stuff, so I understand it all. But there's nothing like just saying to her, right, tell me what's going on. Tell me what worries you. Tell me, what excites you. And getting that interpretation from them. It's absolutely, I think that's a very important role, and particularly as students, I guess, progress to say level 4 of their AAT studies, there are those kind of more narrative task elements which really start to bring out, I think, those broader skills, those more communicative skills, perhaps. Actually, Esther picks up on a point that's very close to my heart, actually, around because if I'm perfectly honest, when I was leaving education, I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. I had no real clue where I saw my career taking me, and to me, accountancy kind of kept a lot of doors open. I kind of figured, well, you know, if you imagine if you go into architecture, you're going to be drawing pictures of houses for the rest of your life. You know, for me, you know, every single company needs an accountant. Every hospital needs an accountant. Every charity needs accountants. Every sector, every industry, every country needs accountants. So when I couldn't really decide what I wanted to do with myself, it just meant I felt I kept the doors open as far as is possible. And absolutely, yeah, you know, Chris, another point there around the range of jobs. You know, I know literally thousands of accountants. I'm a very lucky boy, but I know thousands and thousands of accountants, and very few of them do kind of the same things. They're in all sorts of fields. You know, if I go back to the people I trained with, you know, 26, 27 years ago, they've scattered, you know, to the winds in terms of the different sectors. You know, I've got friends who are now managing partners of accountancy firms. I've got friends who are CFOs of businesses and industry. I've got one of my best friends who qualified with me as a very senior merchant banker now. You know, so you know, there is that broad spread. So these are the kind of points I was sort of hoping would come out. So if I go back to my presentation, apologies for me being a bit ham-fisted with my presentations. I'm not the most technologically astute person in First Intuition, as Rhian and any of my colleagues will tell you. But in terms of reasons, you know, I sort of brainstormed the list earlier of why people might become accountants. And actually, it was your first point, wasn't it, Chris, around earning power, you know, the prestige, the respect, the little letters you get after your name, you know, whether it's AAT or, you know, I'm chartered, so I've got ACCA after my name. In fact, even more than that, I've got FCA because I'm a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, which is, all that means is I'm quite old. You know, you talked about, you know, who you can impress perhaps by being an accountant. You know, if I'm honest, my dad played quite a large role in me becoming an accountant, but he put a certain amount of pressure on me that, as we were talking about earlier, it's a secure job, you know, it's a sensible job, people will respect you. So I was kind of a little bit pushed into it by my dad, in part, as I said, because I didn't really know what else to do with myself, and I figured, well, actually, it does seem like it keeps a lot of doors open. I would argue more doors than, say, training in law or architecture, which I think are a bit, you know, a bit more niche. Some people like the fact it's, you know, it's a professional, you know, sometimes called a white collar. You know, you're working in an office environment, which obviously has a certain level of, I guess, comfort and safety, you know, rather compared to, you know, working, I don't know, in a factory or on a farm or something. So people like that sort of aspect of it, you know, regular hours typically. You know, most accountants would be doing the kind of classic 9 to 5, 5 days a week shift. So rare you get accountants working kind of, you know, silly overtime or night shifts or something. That, you know, talk about, actually, there's I think another point in the chat box around sort of being interested in business, and that was another thing that actually drew me into accountancy. I actually did I went to university, did a degree in economics. Now I realized quite quickly I didn't particularly want to be an economist, but it really kind of sparked my interest in just the world of business and how different types of business operated, from large companies to small companies. And, you know, I think accountancy, just the sheer range of things you study, all the different papers from, you know, you've got all your financial accounting type subjects, but then there's management accounting, there's tax, you know, you even start seeing elements of some, you know, strategic decision making within organizations. So, you know, I think accountancy is a great grounding in how businesses operate. So, you know, if anyone ever wants to run their own business, you know, I think accountancy is not a bad place to start building that sort of knowledge. I think accountancy gives really good progression opportunities. You know, we sort of mentioned the sheer range of different accountancy roles already, but I think the key is that that's at all different levels of an organization. You know, you do get the kind of entry-level roles, the kind of clerk roles in purchase ledger or sales ledger, which actually is where most people tend to start and build their basic, you know, knowledge of how, you know, accounting systems work. But hopefully for most people, that's relatively temporary until they get some experience, maybe pass their exams, get promoted up through, you know, becoming finance managers, maybe even towards financial controllers, and potentially even all the way to the board of directors. You know, there will typically be a finance director or CFO, a chief financial officer, right on the board, you know, making those big, exciting strategic decisions about the future of businesses. And it's also, it's amazing how many, not just the CFO, because you would expect the chief financial officer to probably be an accountant, but it's amazing how many CEOs, the chief executive officer, so the managing director, it's amazing how many of them have got an accountancy background. And in fact, it's something that we're starting to see a bit of a trend towards. You can imagine most people who come into training as accountants do it because they want to be accountants. But we're seeing a bit of a trend that we get students who don't really want to be accountants ultimately, but they're training as accountants because they want to be business leaders. And they sort of recognize that to lead a business, you've sort of got to know how the numbers work. You know, even if you're not the chief financial officer, you know, if you get into a position where you're a chief operating officer or a commercial director, actually having a real good awareness of how the finances of a business work and how the numbers work, I think it's really useful in any role. You know, in fact, we sometimes do training sort of finance for non-finance managers, because any manager in the business really needs to have a bit of an understanding how the numbers work. So I think, you know, training as an accountant does give great, you know, it's that progression opportunity all the way potentially to board level, you know, to actually run a business. And as I said, for me, you know, there was a bit of parental pressure, bit of that prestige and respect, but for me, a lot of it was about keeping my options open, keeping the doors open for actually what I might ultimately then do. And in fact, I went into training. So, you know, I'm not really an accountant at all anymore, but I do obviously train accountants. So actually, you know, my qualification was very much a route into my professional education career, which wouldn't really have been possible without that. So often for people, the basic qualification is as much a stepping stone. You know, as I said, you know, me and a lot of my friends from, you know, when I was in my early 20s, you know, we started at the same place. We started with our same few years of training and qualifying, but our careers have gone off in so many different directions since then. You know, just in terms of that idea of keeping doors open, I mean, the other thing that kind of appealed to me when I was looking at accountancy was you've almost got these two sort of fundamental big chunks of where you can work. We've got practice, so your accountancy firms, and actually that's where I did my training. So I worked for, well, I was going to say PwC, but it wasn't even PwC in those days. This will age me. It was called Coopers & Lybrand, the firm that I actually trained with, who then became part of PwC when they merged with another firm. But I trained in practice. And what you tend to do in practice, you know, I worked for Coopers & Lybrand, but what I'd be doing each week is going out to different clients of the practice to do work for them. So I might be doing audits or doing some bookkeeping work or doing some financial accounting. I had colleagues doing tax advice for clients. And actually the thing that appealed to me about working in practice is I got to see so many different businesses. You know, in a typical year, I mean, I used to go on jobs that might last 1 or 2 weeks. So you can imagine in a typical year, I might be visiting 25 or 30 different companies, you know, going in, talking to their finance staff, looking at their records, looking at their results, looking at how they performed compared to the previous year. So it gave me, you know, I had construction clients. I had a client in Harrogate that did like graphic design. I had food manufacturers. So it actually gave me a really great insight into all these different businesses. It kind of goes back to that point we said around accountancy helping just understand how business works, understand how the world of finance works. That really appealed to me. The drawback, I guess, of working in practice is you're only ever spending a week or two in a particular organization. So you can imagine it's kind of quite shallow. You're sort of in and out. You never get the opportunity to spend months and months really getting into the nitty-gritty of one business. You know, that's very much if you work in industry, and, you know, we've got plenty of students who, you know, they'll work for the finance function of, you know, I train students who work for Green King, for instance, the brewer based in Bury St Edmunds. So you can imagine they work in the finance function of Green King day in, day out, week in, week out for the whole year. So they get to see things in a huge amount of depth and detail. They'll be involved in, you know, particular projects within, you know, that business. So it's, you know, for them, it's, you know, much more deep level of understanding, but obviously in a very niche area. They're only ever going to be looking at brewing, you know, while they work in that particular business. And, you know, but this appealed to me about accountancy as well. The fact you can almost make your choices as to, do you work in practice? Do you work in industry? Do you swap around a little bit? You know, I've got plenty of friends who qualified in practice and then have moved into industry. So they then move into the finance function of a specific business that they're particularly interested in. And as you know, as we've already mentioned, I think Chris, you raised the point about just that sheer breadth of ideas. And you know, I won't go through these in tons of individual detail, but I'm sure you know people will come across concepts like you know being a bookkeeper. You know, bookkeepers are the ones who are kind of keeping the day-to-day records of the business accurate. You know, recording all the transactions, all the. Well, imagine your, I don't know, Amazon. You know, they must be selling millions of things every single day, purchasing millions of things every day. You know, the amount of payroll that they're paying, the rent they're paying, just so many transactions that have got to be recorded accurately in their accounting system, in their nominal ledger, you know, through their trial balance, all the good stuff that I'm sure some of you will have touched on. So you've got, you know, those nitty gritty roles like sales ledger, purchase ledger, you know, working in treasury. Although even I would suggest that those roles have changed quite dramatically in recent years. I mean, I remember when I started in accounting, a lot of this was done very manually. You know, you'd literally have massive big books, ledgers, that's where the name is derived from, just huge books where you're almost writing out line by line every single sale. You know, you'd have your big book that's your sales day book, your big book that's your purchase day book, and you're writing every single sale out line by line. You can imagine how just how time consuming and brain sapping that would be if you had to do it these days for somebody like Amazon. So fortunately, most things these days are done through kind of automated, you know, accounts packages. You know, people use Sage or Xero or equivalent. So actually the bookkeeper's role has changed a bit. I think they're more making sure that all that automated stuff is happening correctly. You know, but fundamentally it's the same ultimate job of recording all the transactions during the accounting period, the year maybe. The accountant then is taking all of that information, so taking all of those books of prime entry, all the nominal ledgers, you know, take the trial balance and actually turn it into a set of accounts. But I like the fact that, you know, even within that realm of accountancy, you've got two real sort of threads or flavors of accountancy. You've got the financial accountants who are kind of doing the year-end process, you know, particularly the pulling together the statutory accounts. So for those of you who've done the likes of advanced bookkeeping, if you're at level 4, even the financial statements for limited companies paper, that's that very kind of regulatory approach of producing your year-end P&L and balance sheet and all the notes to the accounts to file with Companies House. You've also got the management accountants who are perhaps doing more like kind of monthly processes, kind of month-end reporting to management, to the board. You know, fundamentally, management accounting is about providing management with useful information for decision making. That's where we get that point that was raised in the chat box about telling stories almost with the numbers. You know, you're taking maybe that month's figures, analyzing them, producing your KPIs, key performance indicators, but maybe then telling the story that, right, this means that, and this is what we would therefore suggest. Because that's, and personally, and you know, my colleague Nick, me and him always fall out over this. He loves financial accounting. He likes the kind of, I think, you know, compliance-driven nature of it, the kind of performers, the rules, the standards. In my view, is financial accounting is very much looking at the past. It's looking at what has happened. I think management accounting is far more exciting because that's much more involved in, you know, those of you who've done things like budgeting, forecasting, that's management accounting. You know, looking forward at the future, helping with decision making. So if you've done things like limiting factor analysis, break-even analysis, you know, variances, that's all your management accounting stuff, which I personally think is far, far more exciting, but Nick will never listen to me on this. So the accountant's taken all the bookkeeper's work and producing the accounts. The auditor, and actually I spent most of my training career as an auditor, the auditor goes in to actually look at whether the numbers look accurate, do they look like they make sense. So I wouldn't produce accounts, but I'd go in and look at somebody else's work and think, right, can we justify that sales figure? Can we check and test the purchases figure? And again, at level 4, some of you may potentially look at the external auditing optional paper. You know, and actually they're quite common entry-level roles. I've trained plenty of AAT students who fit into one of those kind of categories. Potentially, as you progress on in your career, you can start specializing in, you know, things like being a business analyst, tax advice. You know, if you love your personal tax, your business tax at level 4, there's actually further qualifications. There's ATT, the tax technician qualification, or CTA, the chartered tax qualification that some people go on if they want to really specialize in tax. Some people actually like to specialize in corporate finance, you know, M&A, or mergers and acquisitions, as it's sometimes referred, where they're actually helping companies maybe raise money to buy other companies. And that's quite interesting stuff. My friend that I mentioned, my good friend who's a merchant banker, that's what he does. You know, he literally raises billions in time. He's done transactions that are in the billions, that they're raising money to do huge acquisitions. You know, quite stressful, but really interesting, I would think. And you know, you get situations where businesses aren't doing so well and maybe go bankrupt, and then there's another specialism of insolvency, you know, where sometimes people who qualify as accountants kind of move on into insolvency as a specialism. And actually, you know, just, you know, as I said earlier, one of the things I love about accountancy as well is that sheer breadth of roles. You know, you're really not pigeonholing yourself if you qualify and get an AAT qualification. As well as the breadth of roles, you've got almost that vertical distance you can travel. Some of you may have seen this sort of way of showing the sort of hierarchy or the structure of a company. It's often shown as a pyramid, because you tend to have relatively few people at the top, at the kind of board level, and then obviously the huge numbers of people at the bottom doing the actual work. And, you know, to me, one of the things that really appealed about accountancy is you do typically start at the bottom where you're learning things. You know, I started as a, you know, very junior auditor, sometimes even doing bits of bookkeeping work for our clients, you know, very much looking at the day-to-day activities. You know, that's the kind of more what we might call number crunching, you know, just making sure each transaction is recorded correctly. You know, does require, as it says, that kind of attention to detail. You know, if you're a sales ledger clerk, you've got to make sure that every sale you're posting is going to be recorded correctly. But that's, you know, that's a great grounding, often a great entry level, but hopefully for a lot of us, you gain those skills and that experience, you do well, and then as you pass your exams, as you do well at work, you might then get, you know, promoted up through the kind of chain of the organization. So, you know, moving up to, you know, kind of financial manager, financial controller positions, which I think is where you're starting to just look at things in a slightly higher level. So it's not so much the day-to-day, every single transaction. You know, the financial controller of a business is not going to be interested in every single individual sale. They're going to be looking at the slightly bigger picture. So maybe looking at overall results for an entire week, or overall results for a business area. And particularly, I think at this level, you're starting to look forward a little bit more. I think the operational level is very much what's happening today, whereas at this managerial level, you might be looking a bit more forward into the next few months. So producing budgets, producing forecasts. You can imagine producing a budget is a much harder activity than just recording all the sales for today, because budgets require perhaps a bit of guesswork, perhaps a little bit, you know, thinking about what might happen to the economy. So that to me always sounds like a slightly more exciting, interesting role. But for me, you know, it's when you get to that top level, you know, it's particularly interesting. So, you know, if you get, you know, moved up to almost the board level, where you are going to be very detached, you can imagine, from the individual transactions. You know, the CFO of a large company is not going to be remotely interested in one particular sale. They'll probably be barely interested in a week's worth of sales for one of the divisions. They're going to be looking very, very big picture, looking far further into the future. So this is, you know, when we talk about strategy, we're probably thinking years into the future in terms of the kind of planning that we're doing. Much harder to actually predict. But for me, that's the much more exciting bit. And that was, you know, one of the things that appealed to me about accountancy is the ability to actually get all the way to the top of organizations, even to the position I'm in now, where I'm, you know, I'm not even a finance director, I'm the chief executive of the business, you know, very much leading those kind of longer term decisions. Okay, so we talked a little bit there about becoming an accountant, you know, why might it appeal to us? I just want to pick up on a couple of other points, particularly because they have changed quite dramatically in the last kind of few years. You know, if you go back to when I went into accountancy, it was kind of accepted you probably needed a degree. So 25 years ago, you know, I went to university, got my degree, and then that saw me move into training as an accountant. That's been such a huge, huge shift, particularly in the last sort of 5 years, I would say, that having a degree is by no means, you know, a requirement anymore in accountancy. And I'm just sort of quite interested in, I might stop this briefly while we revert to the chat box. In terms of, you know, you guys on the call live, I mean, What's your thoughts on, do you think degrees are necessary? Are they irrelevant these days? Interested just in what you guys think. Because certainly my dad, when he was pushing me towards accountancy, his view was you need to get a degree if you're going to go into a profession like accountancy. I'm just not convinced that's necessarily the case anymore. What do you guys think? Is a degree really necessary? I mean, how many people on the call actually have degrees? Okay, so Chris saying the politics, good for all sorts of reasons. I mean, what do you think is good about a degree, Chris?
I think what it did for me was get me out of living in Bristol with my mum and dad. It was a way of escaping and learning how to stand on my own 2 feet. So that was the first time I did my own budgeting, living on my own, getting a wider network than just the school I went to. So it really opened up my eyes to the fact that there's all sorts of other things outside of my little network of walking from home to school for, within the same sort of mile or two and that side of things. So it just opened my eyes to the world in a way. But it was probably novel for me doing politics because I went to a comp and we weren't allowed to do a lot of subjects that would have got us into all sorts of degrees. So, and I didn't do well in a foreign language. So there was lots of universities I couldn't even go to because I didn't have a level C and above in French or German or anything like that. So sometimes you just look to what's at the end of your nose. And I had a career advisor that said, well, actually, have you ever thought of going to university? And I thought, no. Simply.
Certainly, I think, it can be a great life experience. I was the same. First time I'd moved away from living with my parents, I moved to literally a different country. I moved from Edinburgh to York. So, going to a different country, it does, forces you to grow up, look after yourself. But I noticed there you didn't really mention anything around what you might learn in your degree being particularly important, or the academic.
No. That's interesting you mentioned that, Gareth, because I think I'm still practicing what I learned there, because what I learned was people are human beings and we're infallible, or not fallible, we're not robots. And why I went into the public sector was very much because I did politics. So I was exposed at a very early stage working at Leeds City Council on the whims of politicians, and they could be the people who are living next door to you. And you could have arguments on the most ridiculous of things in that side of things, but they all need help. And one of the things that sort of I learned is that so much of what I was doing, whatever it was in being able to just understand what people wanted, and that is just relating to somebody else at a human level.
Yeah, and just looking at the chat box, I mean, there's a comment there actually from Gabriel saying, I've always thought you needed a related degree in business or economics to be eligible for AAT or ACCA. That is absolutely not the case, particularly not for AAT. I mean, I always think of AAT as almost being like an equivalent or alternative to a degree. So actually most people doing AAT would do it as school leavers very typically, or, career changes later on in life perhaps. And actually even, because you've got AAT that's a sort of technician level qualification, which it's levels 2, 3, 4 in terms of the UK educational framework. ACCA, and if you've ever heard of CIMA or ICAEW, which are the higher level chartered qualifications, they're actually level 7. So they do sit higher than AAT, but I always think that AAT is almost equivalent to going to a university and doing a degree. So it's a good school leaver route. People who do a degree would more typically go straight into perhaps one of the higher level qualifications, but actually even the likes of ACCA that you mentioned, Gabriel, you don't need to have a degree to do those. They've actually got, as long as you've got a kind of couple of GCSEs, they have actually increasingly flexible entry requirements. I think all of the accounting qualifications, they're recognizing that not everybody's having a kind of traditional linear educational journey in their lives anymore. Not everybody does school and then college and then university and then on to something else. A lot of people come from, much more left field places. And actually, I like the point as well from Rebecca actually about you know, the fees and the debt. I mean, that is a big consideration. I remember when I went to university, I left university with £1,800 of debt, which felt like a huge amount at the time. But compared to what, you know, you're talking now, I think on average it's closer to £60,000 of debt for a 3-year degree. You know, and you know, yes, university can be a great life experience, but that comes at quite a cost. You know, I look at my own daughters, and you know, they're only 11 and 14, so a few years away. You know, but you know, if they want a life experience, I'd almost rather just pay them to go and have a year abroad, you know, and go and work a ski season or something, rather than perhaps pay for them to do a 3-year degree that isn't necessarily going to be the best route for them. I'm a big believer that if you go back sort of 10, 15, 20 years, often people who didn't go to university, it was because the universities didn't choose them. You know, they didn't meet whatever entry requirements there were. I think nowadays it's much more that if somebody doesn't go to university, it's because they're not choosing university. It's a much more positive choice, that actually that amount of debt, almost giving up 3 years that you could be getting on with a career, you could be doing something like AAT, is for a lot of people a much sounder choice. In fact, I was chatting to, you know, because I see a lot of our students who will come in as school leavers, do AAT, and then, you know, ACCA or ICAEW. And I was chatting to one of our recently qualified ICAEW students who'd done the school leaver route. And I said to her, so Laura, why didn't you go to university? And she said, Gareth, I've got 2 accountancy qualifications now. I've got AAT and ICAEW, and she was actually a prize winner at ICAEW as well. So she's got 2 accountancy qualifications. She's got 2 apprenticeships under her belt as well. She's got 5 years of work experience. She's now managing teams in the office. She's bought her own house, and she's 23. And she said, you know, what would university possibly have given me that I don't already have, other than perhaps holding me back a few years? So, you know, I just thought that was quite a sort of powerful story from her. So yeah, no, I just wanted to sort of pick up and talk a little bit about that side of things for, you know, just considering, do you actually need a degree? You know, in fact, we're seeing a lot of the employers that we work with, you know, again, if you go back a few years, they might have recruited 4 graduates and a couple of school leavers each year. And that is really flipping around. A lot of the employers I work with, they'd rather take on school leavers and just train them up from scratch. The other question I was going to put on here, just about apprenticeships, because we get students doing AAT, kind of doing it for just sitting the exams and just getting the AAT qualification, but we get increasing numbers of students doing it under apprenticeships. And actually, it's true as well for those higher level qualifications like ACCA or ICAEW or CIMA. You know, even for graduates, apprenticeships is a much more common route than we've ever seen in the past. And I just thought I'd sort of float with the group again, and I'll close that down so we can sort of revert to the chat box. I mean, is anyone on the call an apprentice or considering an apprenticeship or heard of apprenticeships? Just interested in what the thoughts are. Yeah, I agree with that, Chris. Actually, one of the things I love about AAT is it's very open access. You know, there's very, you know, no real entry requirements. It just matters where you come in to the qualification. Yeah, and I quite agree, actually, apprenticeships. And I wanted to mention apprenticeships because I find that often when I talk to kind of aspiring young accountants, you know, particularly if they're of school or, you know, actually, Julie, that's very commonplace, you know, not really understanding apprenticeships. And I think often young adults, they're advised by parents or advised by careers officers at school who are still giving the same advice they would have been giving 20 years ago, because I think apprenticeships are so different now. You know, I've had parents, you know, I sometimes attend careers fairs where you'll be talking about AAT, ICAEW, you know, careers in accountancy, and we always tend to talk about apprenticeships. And I've had parents who are there with their, you know, GCSE or A-level, you know, son or daughter, and the parents will say, oh, actually, no, my daughter's quite bright, she wouldn't do an apprenticeship. And I think they're thinking about what apprenticeships were like 20 years ago, when, to be fair, they were probably the sort of last option for people who didn't maybe make university. Apprenticeships are so different now. You know, apprenticeships basically is a way of employers accessing government funding to support any training. And there's a comment there actually, Julie, about, you know, yes, absolutely, you know, your classic apprenticeship might be plumber, electrician, hairdresser even. And that's actually what a lot of people think of apprenticeships. Oh no, my daughter wouldn't do an apprenticeship. She's better than doing hairdressing. She's quite clever. She wants to be an accountant. Well, actually accountants, you know, most of them now, I mean, 4 years ago, I think 5% of my students were apprentices. Last September, with the last big intake coming in from school and university, 55% of them were apprentices. And that's across all qualifications, and that's school leavers and graduates, you know, because employers, you can imagine, apart from anything, employers are keen to use government funding if it's available to pay for the training, you know, and that's what it's there for. It's there to support training of, you know, young adults at the start of their careers, which, you know, if ever it's important that we support people in their careers, it's now during this current situation. But actually apprenticeships also, you know, they actually give a broader range of development within the program. You know, if you're just studying AAT, you know, yes, you'll learn how to do tax, you'll learn how to do financial reporting, you'll learn how to do management accounting, you'll learn those very technical bits of knowledge. But with an apprenticeship, you get those anyway, you know, you still do the AAT exams, but actually you also get development in other, what I think are quite important, skills and behaviors. That's what they call the skills and behaviors. So an apprentice gets trained in communication skills. They get trained in team working. They get trained in negotiation. They get trained in leadership. Areas which personally, I think, you know, I look at my career now, I'm not a chief executive of a business because I can do a bank reconciliation. You know, I'm not a director because I can do a tax computation. You know, you can imagine those technical things you learn being an accountant, they are important, but it's not really what dictates, you know, that pyramid, certainly not what dictates how high on that pyramid you go. You know, I'm in my position because I'm good at problem solving, decision making, I've got leadership skills, I'm good at communication, you know, good at negotiation. Now, I actually had to make all that stuff up as I went along. You know, I never got trained in those things. I got trained in the technical stuff, but the other stuff I kind of had to learn on the hoof over 20 years, a lot of trial and error, a lot of error. You're still making errors now. So I'm quite jealous of, you know, some of these youngsters coming through now who are actually being trained and developed in what I think are the more important skills, you know, particularly as the nature of accountancy changes, you know, the impact of automation, of artificial intelligence, machine learning. You know, the number crunching stuff is being automated. You know, we don't actually have to do a bank rec at work anymore because we use Xero, and Xero is clever enough, it can do the bank rec on its own, the platform. So actually we don't need to do the bank rec. What we do is we then interpret the results and communicate it to the necessary people. So actually the technical skills, I would argue, are becoming less important. It's these broader soft skills. A couple of questions there just about, you know, looking to get into apprenticeship schemes. And absolutely, Chris, you know, the AAT, if you look on the AAT website, and actually we've got some stuff on our website. In fact, if you go to our website, you know, on the home page, there's a big button for apprenticeships, which has then got a bit of a detail of different levels of apprenticeships. But, you know, it's been a fundamental change, and certainly don't ever turn your nose up at apprenticeships. You know, I personally think that non-apprentices have got a bit of a battle on their hands to prove that they're as good as apprentices who are getting trained in all these other, you know, wider skills, which, you know, I think are personally, you know, they're the skills that are often described as soft skills, which I think is such a bad name for them. You know, it makes, you know, soft skills, it makes them sound like they're not the important ones. You know, these are the skills I think are most important. And in some respects, they're the hard, you know, rather than soft skills, they're almost the hard skills. They're the harder ones, you know, to actually develop. You know, what's easier in life, doing a bank rec or having a difficult conversation with a member of staff who's not performing properly? You know, give me the bank rec every day of the week. That's way easier to do than the interpersonal things. So actually being developed and trained in them, I think, is way more interesting. So, sorry, I'm starting to ramble. Is it okay if I ramble a bit? I do have a tendency to ramble at times. So let's go back to my presentation then, see where we'd got to. So we just talked a bit there about sort of graduate versus school leavers, apprenticeships versus non-apprenticeships, you know, and they are just different routes ultimately to the same objective, which is to get qualified in, you know, a qualification as an accountant. But we can then actually think, you know, amongst all the different approaches to becoming a qualified accountant. AAT is not the only game in town, but I think it's quite an important game. So again, if we can revert to the chat box, actually, I'm really interested, and I'll be very interested in your perspective, Chris, on this. And actually, Rhian, I mean, you've been teaching AAT students for a number of years like me. Now, why AAT? Why is AAT the one that people want to do? So let's maybe have a see what comes through on the chat box then. You know, why have some of you chosen AAT?
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear what where people have come from in thinking about AAT. I fell into it because I wasn't offered it. You know, sometimes you have to make the best opportunities that you have. I went and did another professional qualification rather than AAT, but I never knew anything about the AAT until about 10 years ago, to be honest. So, you know, I think that there's a lot more advertising of AAT now, which I think is really good, because people need to understand, you know, sort of what opportunities something like AAT does. And one of the things I love about AAT, like I said before about accessibility, you can start off with knowing absolutely nothing at all about finance, wanting to set yourself up in business, and they have something called Access, which is that entry level, where you just start from the very, very basics. You know, and I never thought I'd be an accountant. I wasn't very good at maths in particular, but I fell into it, and I found, you know, it was the logic of it rather than just being able to add 2 and 2 that was a good thing. And like I said, the fact I liked people, and a lot of people just need help when it comes to numbers. And so from that point of view, you can get an awful lot out of doing that very basic level of AAT, and then you can see whether you want to go up to the next level. And level 2 is when it starts getting serious, isn't it, Gareth?
Yeah.
And then you can go on to level 3 and then to level 4. So you have those choices, but I would say, you know, you can get a complete qualification with AAT going up through to level 4 and get those letters after your name. And one of the brilliant things that AAT introduced a couple of years ago was, by even those people just stopping at level 3, they can now be qualified bookkeepers, and you can get the letters after your name for that, and you can get out there and be licensed to practice, which means that those opportunities that you can get even at level 3 are absolutely wonderful, and they give you a huge foundation for so many other things. Like Gareth, you were saying before about whether you want to go into other spheres of finance sectors, if you like, or just go on and run your business like you've done with First Intuition and get to be a chief exec, because that foundation that you get in finance is second to none when it comes to business, because you get an overview of an organization like nothing else. Even legal practitioners don't get the overview that we get working in finance, especially from the bottom up. And we probably always know where the bodies are buried as well in a lot of instances.
Well, I know CFOs. You know, I know a CFO of a major airline who's AAT qualified, then went on to chartered, and has obviously gone on to a very successful career. And he still says that he goes back to his AAT basics. He'll get out a piece of paper, get his T accounts out, sometimes go back to the real basics that were drilled into him at AAT. And in fact, when I'm teaching, I sometimes teach final level ICAEW or ACCA classes, and you can always tell the students that did AAT first, because they know their basics, they know double entry, they know, what a journal is, what a suspense account is. Whereas, the graduates, even relevant graduates who've come through straight into ICAEW, sometimes it's like, I sort of vaguely remember being told about debits and credits, but I can't really remember them. But I think you're quite right that the AAT has done a great job on sort of branding and promote, it's been a while since I've been on the tube, obviously, but every time I go on the tube, there's AAT adverts up in the tube and on billboards. So I think they've done a great job of raising their own profile. I think they do sort of television advertising. And I completely agree. Actually, one of the genius things I think they did a few years ago is the way they sort of sliced and diced the qualification. So you don't have to do a 3-year qualification. That's quite intimidating for some people. So, the fact they hived off the level 2 certificate in bookkeeping, 2 papers, maybe 3 or 4 months worth worth of work that give you a specific qualification. You then got the level 3 certificate in bookkeeping that can be another exercise, and then that gives you some letters after your name, the AATQB, which I think is a great designation, been very, very popular. And you can almost do it in little chunks and think, right, I'll do that first, I'll do that 4 months. All right, I quite enjoyed that, I'll take it on to the next step. So it's not quite seeing it as a big, intimidating 3-year journey. And I've seen some comments actually in the chat box going by, I think, you know, about how employers, you know, I spend most of my job talking to employers, and employers love AAT. They just love the foundations it builds. You know, they know that if they've got somebody who's done AAT, they know that they'll remember their basics of accounting. They know that they'll be aware of how to put together a set of accounts. You got any thoughts, Rhian, actually, on anything we can add to what's great about AAT?
Sorry.
It's the phrase of 2020, isn't it? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just typing back to Rebecca there. Sorry, Rebecca was just saying that she's self-studying level 3. So I was just about to say that if you're not already a member, then the Facebook group, the Students Independent group, you might find really helpful. If you ever get stuck with any questions, people are great on there. You know, everyone comes together and helps out.
I think there's like 18,000 members or something, and it's very supportive, great sort of, you know, informal community of people helping each other out. Yeah, no, fantastic. Yeah, it's a great piece of advice. But I thought I'll just go back to my presentation, because again, I sort of brainstormed what I thought of as, you know, a few things I like about AAT as a qualification. Well, you know, we talked earlier about that prestige, credibility, one of the reasons you might even become an accountant. And, you know, if you, well, even at an early stage, if you finish some of the exams, you can get that AATQB, the qualified bookkeeper status. So that's quite a nice early win for some students. And then you can go the whole hog, finish off the entire qualification up to level 4, and then get the MAAT designation. And, you know, the thing is, once you've done that, that stays with you for the rest of your career. You know, and the credibility gives you, you know, having letters after your name, you know, when you're talking to, you know, banks about raising money, as soon as they realize you're a qualified accountant, I just think you go up in their estimation. You know, if you're talking to potential suppliers, if you're talking to landlords, having those qualifications just gets you that extra bit of, I think, respect, you know, from people that you're dealing with. As we've said, you know, it's a brilliant training in the fundamentals of bookkeeping and accounting. You know, whether you end up as a CFO or a managing partner, whatever, you'll understand the basics of how the accounts of a business work. A lot of people increasingly, and this goes back to the point we were talking about in terms of whether you come out as a school leaver and almost view AAT as a kind of alternative to going to university, which a lot of people do view it as a sort of stepping stone, that they'll do their AAT, then they'll move up to ICAEW or CIMA or ACCA, one of those higher level chartered qualifications. And actually having finished AAT gives you exemptions. So actually if you've done AAT, it means you don't have to do some of the early level exams for those high level qualifications. So, you know, it does save you a bit of time when you move up. So that's a, you know, as I said, it's an increasingly common pathway rather than going to university and then into chartered accountancy, you know, using AAT as that kind of pathway. Although for some students, AAT is all they ever want, all they ever get. And that's absolutely fantastic as well. AAT is a very much a globally recognized qualification. There are actually students, I mean, we've got students we've got a couple of students studying AAT in Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. We've got students in Canada, in the Far East, in Italy. So it is a globally recognized body with students all over. They've got a surprising number of students in Myanmar, what used to be known as Burma. So there's students in Rangoon and Mandalay. So, you know, there are students all over the world doing AAT. So if you fancy traveling overseas as part of your career, AAT is, you know, great for doing that. You know, we've mentioned a few times, but absolutely respected by employers who love it. And in fact, I get so many employers who they would take an AAT qualified over a relevant graduate every day of the week. It is a membership body. So actually, once you're a member of the AAT, once you've got that MAAT status, there are various benefits you get from membership of the organisation. The AAT is very supportive, both of its students, but also of its members. They provide various resources, CPD to help, you know, with professional, sort of continuing professional development once you're qualified. As Chris actually mentioned, it's, you know, it's an open access qualification. Some of those high level chartered qualifications do have a kind of entry requirements, and I think there was a comment in the chat box, I think maybe by Julie, around, you know, feeling that maybe ACCA was kind of a bit high to start with, and actually, you know, people often use AAT as a nice way to ease themselves gently into some of those higher level qualifications. You know, do a couple of years of AAT, you then get exemptions. You'll also have a lot of very good knowledge as you move up to the chartered qualifications, because diving straight into ACCA, I always describe it, it's like jumping into the deep end of the pool. You know, it's possible, but, you know, it's kind of sink or swim, and you are straight in at reasonably challenging things. Whereas if you do, you know, a bit of level 2 through level 3, level 4 AAT, that really nicely builds you up to then moving into, you know, some of those higher level qualifications. So, just thinking, if just got a couple of minutes left, really. Any other thoughts coming through on the chat box, actually, that we can pick up on? So Esther's question. So AAT is a technician level qualification, which is almost like the starting point of becoming an accountant. Chartered qualifications are just a step up. It's perhaps a bit like the difference between a GCSE and an A level. You know, they can be part of the same journey, and the AAT is a great starting point, but it's only up to what we call level 4 in the UK's kind of educational framework. It's equivalent, if you've finished your AAT, that's the equivalent of doing the first year of a degree, you know, or maybe the first year of one of those chartered qualifications. The chartered, though, they then go on another couple of years up to level 7. So is a, you know, it's more highly regarded, you know, although AAT is very well recognised. Yeah, you know, as Chris says, more exams, harder exams, higher standards. It's like anything in life, you know, you know, walk before you run, and things will get more challenging. Although my view in everything in life, my philosophical sort of quote to start tailing things off here is, nothing easy is worthwhile in life, and nothing worthwhile is easy. You know, nothing that I have, you know, I found my qualification extremely challenging when I was doing it, very stressful, hard work. That's why I did it. I did it because it was stressful. I did it because it was hard work, because I knew that would change my career and change my life. You know, if it was easy, everyone would do it. And if everyone can do it, then it's not going to be worth anything, is it? So, you know, don't be put off, you know, whether it's AAT or progressing on that journey to something later. Don't be put off because it's difficult. You know, to me, that's why you want it. It's because it's valuable and it will change your career. And actually, you know, Chris has mentioned there in the chat box about the AAT's branch network. Absolutely. I mean, you know, I've got colleagues who attend those branch network events. Great for networking. You know, great for sort of CPD often, and, you know, events that they run. So, you know, as a member of the AAT, they're well worth getting involved in. Any points you want to raise as we're finishing off, Rhian?
No, I think you've done marvellous.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And worn a nice shirt for the occasion as well. Brilliant. Okay, well, that is our hour. Amazing. That's flown by, actually. I thought we were going to struggle to fill an hour, if I'm perfectly honest, but we've had plenty to talk about there. So thank you very, very much for helping me finish off day 3 of our festival. So we are more than halfway through the week, which is lovely. It's been going really well so far. Delighted with the feedback we've had and the people attending. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thanks, Chris, particularly for your input. That was really helpful to have your perspective as well. Thank you, Rhian, for helping out with the chat box, and hopefully we may see some of you over tomorrow and Friday. And in fact, we have on Friday lunchtime, and it's still in talks, you know, it's one of those mystery speakers, but we're still in conversation with a very exciting possible speaker for Friday, which I'm really looking forward to for the Friday lunchtime session. So well worth registering for that one, because I think that's going to be an absolute humdinger if we do get her nailed down, which I think we're just about there with. But thank you very much for joining me this evening. I've really enjoyed that, and hopefully see you in the next couple of days. Cheers then. Good night.
Good night.